thank you for sticking with us. This is the last panel of the day, and it's going to bring together two key themes of the conference and the wider context within which land reform is taking place. The first is the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, which was published by the Scottish Government in September 2017, so just 2 years ago, and it's the first of its kind in the world. The statement sets a vision for a strong and dynamic relationship between Scotland's people and its land, and it recognises that along with rights to land come responsibilities. Responsibilities to your neighbours, to your local community, and also to the wider public good. And it's this statement which underpins a lot of the work that the Land Commission is doing around good practice and cultural change that you've heard so much about this morning. Land rights and responsibilities apply just as much to urban areas as they do rural areas, and they aim to promote greater diversity in the ownership of land, including more community ownership, better involvement of communities in decisions around land which are going to impact on them, and improved standards of land ownership around stewardship of our land as a future resource. And it's this connection between land ownership and use to the achievement of the broader human rights agenda, which is part of wider international efforts under the banner of responsible business conduct. And these recognise the need for all of us, but particularly the business enterprises, to increase our positive contributions to society and minimise the harms done, this so-called social licence. So that's the first theme. The second theme, as we heard from our Cabinet Secretary this morning, is around the significant challenges we face here in Scotland and are being faced across the world in terms of both rising inequality, as Shona so well explained this morning, as well as the climate emergency. The Scottish Government's commitment to move to a net zero carbon country, as seen by the passing of the Climate Bill last week in Parliament, focuses on creating a fairer and greener economy. There are huge implications in this in relation to land, not just in terms of what we do with our land, but who owns it and how we make those decisions. And how we navigate these challenges are critical in terms of ensuring that we are able to successfully mitigate this climate emergency, that we do this in a way which is fair and productive, and in terms of what this means for land reform on the ground. So I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon for this final panel by three very inspiring people who I hope are going to be able to carry this conversation forward now and also after we finish. We have Professor Dieter Helm, Professor Deborah Roberts, and Dr. Chris Dalglish. Like the other panels, they're each going to speak for about 5 minutes, and I'm going to be quite strict on time, I'm afraid, so that we finish promptly at 4:15. We're then going to have a bit of a facilitated conversation here up on the stage before I open it up into questions and answers. I finally wanted to remind you that we are trying to take this conversation out beyond these four walls through social media, particularly Twitter, using the Land and Economy hashtag. So if you're on Twitter, please start chatting amongst yourselves and let other people know what we're talking about this afternoon. So I'd like to start first with Professor Dieter Helm, CBE, who's a Professor of Energy Policy and an Official Fellow of Economics at New College, University of Oxford. He's also the Independent Chair of the Natural Capital Committee. So, Professor, how can Scotland's Land Rights and Responsibilities framework help to address the big challenges and trends ahead, such as climate change and rising inequality?
So just a small question.
Just a small question, and only 5 minutes.
Okay, only 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to duck the narrow issues about land ownership and community involvement, etc. Many more people understand those much better than I do. And in the 5 minutes, I'm going to concentrate on a broader question, which is, what is the purpose for which the land is going to be used as and when it's reformed in its structure, etc. And it's obviously a huge part of the Scottish economy. Natural capital, along with manufactured capital and human capital, is what makes the economy tick. From the outside, it looks like a set of assets, both in the urban areas and in the rural areas, which is underutilised, and it's pregnant with enormous economic opportunities to make Scotland a green or greener and more prosperous land. Now, there are lots of dimensions to this, and I'm mostly concerned with biodiversity, water quality, recreation, mental and physical health, all those things that contribute enormously to economic growth. But because climate change is a specific question, let me make a few remarks about climate change and the land and how Scottish land could be part of natural carbon sequestration and make a significant contribution. I want to premise my remark with one comment. If you achieve net zero by whatever date you've set, it is not true, as our Climate Change Committee asserts for the UK and is asserted more widely, that you'll stop causing climate change. Climate change is about carbon consumption, not carbon production. If you want to hit your target and you want to do it quickly, close Grangemouth, close all the rest of Scottish industry, import the stuff from China instead. You will increase global warming, but you'll get on your path towards carbon production zero. And when this was being debated in the wider UK context, British Steel was up for closure at the same time. Of course, if you close British Steel, you will reduce your carbon emissions and you'll get yourself on the path to net zero. But you'll increase climate change by importing the stuff back from China. So bear in mind it's your carbon consumption that matters, and it's imports as well as home production which is causing climate change. So the challenge is much bigger than the one that's been put forward of net zero carbon production. Now, almost all the effort on this front has gone into how to reduce emissions. And that's important. And particularly in the electricity sector, where bluntly, it's easier than in most other sectors. We've done most of the easy low-hanging fruit, and lots of wind farms and solar panels, particularly wind farms, contribute to that process. However, climate change is an equation of two parts. Our natural capital and natural environment absorb carbon, suck it out of the atmosphere, and have been doing for a couple of billion years, long before we came across onto this planet. And what that means is that we should look at that side of the equation as well as the equation of not producing the emissions in the first place. And that's all about soils, trees, the marine environment, and peat. And when you look at Scottish land from a global perspective, you have enormous deposits of carbon in peat. And the first thing you do in a country like Scotland, if you care about climate change, is stop losing carbon from those peat bogs and start to let the sphagnum moss come back and reconstitute those bogs and get on with the sequestration. There's enormous opportunities for forestry, but the right sort of trees in the right place with multiple benefits are not rows of spruce and now eucalyptus trees that can do the carbon in a silo mentality, but neglect all those other benefits we get from appropriately planted trees. Soils have been losing carbon on a phenomenal rate. I'm told that carbon in the soil is 4 times that in the atmosphere, and modern agriculture has been stripping out carbon from our land really on a grand scale. It's terrible in England, but you have intensively farmed land here too. It doesn't have to be like that, and putting the carbon back into the soil, farming the land sustainably is a good revenue potential in the future. And with agriculture up for reform, with the common agricultural policy being reformed, even if you manage to stay in the EU, you'll still face the move towards public goods and public money. Good luck, and I hope we all end up there, but that's an aside. So this is the moment of opportunity. And so if you use the land properly, a whole set of economic growth opportunities in Scotland can be realised. The land can be farmed with carbon in mind. It can be made more sustainable. You can use the natural capital to deal with the physical and mental health crises. And in that context, I use the word crises. At the one end, the obesity problems. At the other, the mental health difficulties, all of which the green environment contributes to. You can improve the water quality. You can deal with the flooding issues through natural capital measures. And of course, you can do something to enhance the biodiversity of Scotland and make it genuinely green. So I would advocate using the carbon challenge, which is much bigger than currently expressed, as a major opportunity to use the land better, but do it not as a silo, but do it as part and parcel of these multiple carbon and other environmental benefits that you can have, and that will make Scotland a more prosperous and country with a higher rate of sustainable economic growth than it's currently committed to. 5 minutes.
Exactly. Thank you very much. This is, you're not the first person this morning. You'll not be surprised to know that you're not the first person today who've mentioned the fact that we should move on from thinking about the climate emergency as a problem and seeing it as an opportunity to unlock new possibilities for Scotland. So, I would like to move on to Professor Deborah Roberts. He's the Director of Science at James Hutton Institute and holds a joint post as Chair in Real Estate at the University of Aberdeen Business School. The same question to you, Deborah. How can Scotland's Land Rights and Responsibilities Framework help to address these big challenges ahead, such as climate change and rising inequality?
Okay, thank you very much. I wish I'd gone first. So I've chosen to focus on two specific challenges which are facing rural Scotland, where I think land ownership, land use and land management decisions are going to be critical in ensuring Scotland achieves the vision that it's set itself. The first relates to the challenge of ensuring a vibrant, remote rural economies and areas, and this is an issue which was right back at the very start of our land reform process, but particularly in an era of demographic change and population ageing in particular. The second issue I'm going to focus on is the climate change emergency, and in particular the issues facing agriculture as it addresses climate change and the biodiversity challenges in a way which ensures a just transition, because it's fairly complicated. Now I think both of those challenges are complex, but they both require a sort of systems approach, a cross-sectoral approach, and critically an approach which requires people talking to each other. And to the extent that all of those principles are embedded in the Land Rights and Responsibilities statement, I think we're in a good place. It's what we'd call a necessary but not sufficient condition. So first of all, vibrant rural economies. Now Scotland's rural areas over the last decade have performed very, very differently. And one of the things that has become quite clear in terms of their relative performance is that the key thing is the extent to which local production is underpinned by local labour. In other words, that's an obvious statement really, the extent to which the production in the household sphere are interconnected, interdependent. That might sound obvious, but the issue that faces remote rural areas that a very high proportion of their population are beyond working age. And with population ageing, that's going to get even worse, and with ongoing out migration of young people, that's going to get even worse. And I looked at some of the statistics this morning to try and look it up, and I actually thought they were wrong. The data is so extreme in terms of predictions, in terms of the population profile. So what's really important, I think, right now, is to put as much effort as possible into retaining young people. And a lot of emphasis, I know, has been put in terms of affordable housing in rural areas. The issues we were just talking about new entrants and the mixing, the matching, not the mixing, the matching process in terms of farmers, they're brilliant initiatives. So my message would be, we need to think wholly in terms of jobs and people and homes, and we need to take this place-based approach. In terms of climate change, it's really, really clear. The most recent intergovernmental panel statements have shown that agriculture is going to play a really important role. And that's because not only can it help reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions, but it has this potential to actually go beyond and sequester carbon. So it is beyond net zero. Agriculture can be climate positive. It does bring climate opportunities, and that's the challenge for the sector. And you might think right now in the context of Brexit, that's very, very good news for farmers, because in a sense it justifies continuing support. And it is very, very good news. It is the public money for public goods argument. But there's two issues I wanted to just stress, if I might, that are slightly complicating, that need to be overcome. One relates to timescale. So it takes a long time to establish biodiverse rich habitats. It takes a long time to generate more carbon in the soils. It takes a long time for agroforestry to actually start sequestering carbon. Now farmers don't necessarily have that time. They don't think in terms of that time scale for their own personal reasons, for business reasons, perhaps because of their succession planning, and tenancy conditions might be problematic in that respect. So timescale is an issue which somehow we need to address. The other issue is geographic scale. Many of the changes that are required in terms of biodiversity and climate change actually need landscape scale or catchment scale initiatives. Biodiversity needs connectivity. This requires collaboration often between landowners. So again, by encouraging transparency in land ownership, by encouraging a collaborative approach and engagement in the decision making, or requiring people to prepare land management plans and share land management plans, this is all very good and positive. I just want to finish by being slightly provocative, because there are some very disruptive technologies which are on the agenda which might help, but they might not. They bring their own issues. And the one I want to talk about is vertical farming or indoor farming, because this, in theory, provides a means of providing food supply independent of an increasingly uncertain climate and independent of that condition that we're taught in economics, that land is fixed in supply. Suddenly it actually removes that. For me, thinking long term, it's a means of changing what at the moment is a very embedded sort of way of thinking of food and the environment as a trade-off. Because it provides a way of growing food in a different environment and allowing horizontal land, if you like, to be farmed in a more sustainable way. There's other ways this is very, very disruptive as well. We often talk, or at Hutton we concentrate on its potential for food production, but equally it can be used as a controlled environment to breed natural resources like Scots pine or heather varieties in a controlled environment which are going to be more resilient to the future. We can do that, plant breeding. Or linking back to the communities idea, we've heard just recently about the amount of urban derelict land, and often vertical farming or indoor farming is thought of the way of facilitating community development in inner city areas. But it could be just as well a really good way of communities growing food in remote rural areas where renewable energy is in excess supply and where actually fresh food is actually quite expensive and hard to source. So it's completely changing the potential out there. It's a disruptive technology. So in summary, in relation to both of those issues, the vibrant rural economies and the climate change emergency transition of agriculture, I think the land rights responsibilities statement is very, very positive. And why it's positive is because it encourages, a place-based approach in terms of the rural economies and a systems-based approach in terms of food production. So thank you. I don't know how long.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Deborah. That was extremely insightful. I'd like to finally ask Dr. Chris Dalglish to answer the same question. Chris is the founding director of Inherit, which is the Institute for Heritage and Sustainable Human Development.
Well, I think the answer that I'd like to focus on is it helps us to address these challenges in a just way. If I take the example of climate change, which is, we've just heard, land is vital to how we respond to climate change in all these ways. So for me, the value of the land rights and responsibilities framework in that context is the human rights approach that it takes to these decisions around land as we try and address these big challenges. It brings environmental and humanitarian concerns into the same frame so that they can be dealt with at the same time and together rather than separating them out. And I think it provides us with some quite clear direction, actually quite concrete direction in terms of who should be involved in decisions around land and which interests and consequences should be taken into account. It's quite an analytical framework, let's say, built into the statement, I feel, on that. It's part of just to step back from the land rights responsibility statement for a moment, it's part of a wider tradition, of course, of promoting justice in relation to environmental issues. Environmental justice is a concept that's been around for many decades now, to recognise that some people are marginalised in decisions around environmental matters, and they're also unfairly harmed by environmental problems such as pollution. Climate justice is a more recent kind of extension of that idea. If I can just briefly quote, I think it's neatly summed up in Scotland's own climate change adaptation programme, the second iteration of which was published, I think, just last week by the Scottish Government, which says, The negative impacts of climate change are likely to be felt most by those who are already vulnerable to its effects, yet have done little or nothing to cause the problem. So there's a need for climate justice in this context. And finally, just as a kind of third example of this justice idea, conservation justice takes us in a different kind of direction. It's an idea that's been promoted at global level by, for instance, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature for a number of years now. And it's something we looked at here in Scotland in a report that we published with Community Land Scotland last year on community empowerment and landscape. Conservation justice, the idea that you can have programs or policies which have let's say, a positive environmental objective around conservation, but can have, depending how they're framed, negative consequences for people, for their communities, their livelihoods, for their rights. So conservation needs always to go with justice hand in hand. So stepping back from all that, yes, urgent action to address climate change and the decisions we take around land are vital to that, but that needs to be just action and just decisions is the point I guess I'm trying to make here. And as we've been hearing all day, there's great potential for injustice in how these decisions are taken about the use of land in this context to occur, because of, for example, the concentration of land ownership and therefore the extent to which people are not involved necessarily in decisions about how that land is used and the impact it has on them. Because also of our institutional cultures, which around environmental issues, let's say on the whole, to generalise, there's a tradition of, again, not involving people in decisions that might affect them and prioritising, almost single-mindedly sometimes, an environmental objective. So things are changing, of course. Engagement, empowerment are now very much part of our vocabulary. But I think the evidence suggests that we've still to see those feed through into practice sufficiently in the way we need to see for these injustices to be avoided. It's therefore important that we have the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement with a very clear human rights and explicit human rights basis, which gives us guidance on this. It's important that the Land Commission is promoting culture change, which is a phrase we've heard several times today. And important, I think, that the Land Commission, its wider work, is promoting those twin problems of power and participation, which I think are at the root of all of this. So if I can just finish on that point and just underline that word participation, which runs through the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. It's also a core principle of a human rights approach. It's the foundation of a lot of human rights thinking. And I think it's quite valuable in the statement that it talks about community participation particularly, and in two senses. One is participation in decisions. So people who are affected by decision should take part in that decision as the basic kind of summary of that. It's about decision making. But secondly, also participation in a different sense of participation in ownership and in management and in use. So yes, empowerment and decisions, but also in actually doing things and implementing these changes which we all need to see. Both are very important, and if we can push further in that direction, we get much closer to being able to meet, communities being able to meet their needs and fulfill their ambitions, but also society being able to tap into, I think, that capacity and that creativity that exists across the country in communities to help deliver some of the land use changes which will lead to tackling the big challenges. There we are.
Thank you, Chris. I wanted just to build on what you just said in terms of this connection between a just transition in terms of our response to the climate emergency, what the Cabinet Secretary described this morning as this ambition in terms of Scotland's economy being both green and fair in terms of the current programme for government, and this relationship with the human rights framework. Could you say a little bit more about how we've had this fundamental shift in the human rights framework in terms of reconciling both property rights with the wider realisation of economic, social and cultural rights, and what the Land Rights Responsibility Statement does to enable that to happen?
Yeah, okay. So, well, I think there's a lot in that, but I think the point I was trying to make when I at the beginning said, I think it does provide us concrete direction. I called it an analytical framework. I mean, the question of who should participate in the decision, who's affected by it, is the basic answer. But the rights there's a kind of well-developed, well-understood, I suppose, international framework there, which lays out a series of rights, and economic, social and cultural rights particularly. Yes, property owners are potentially affected and therefore are traditionally consulted or whatever. But with economic, social and cultural rights, you've got a framework for asking a series of questions to identify who's potentially affected and in what way. So there's a right to work. Well, whose right to work might be affected here? Or the other important thing in there is not just the existing kind of situation, but the idea of progressively fulfilling people's rights. So we want to make improvements with every decision. So it's not just whose right to work is affected by this decision. If we take all this land out of agriculture and put it under forestry, for example, well, whose work is affected by that? But also, does that help create good work for people? So is it a progressive kind of decision? Right to work, right to health, you mentioned. Whose physical and mental health is potentially affected here. Right to housing is in there. So whose housing conditions and provision is affected by this decision. Right to cultural life, I think, is a very important one, because that speaks to your kind of almost to your right to a kind of vibrant community life. So how does this affect the neighbours of depopulation, for example? Does this help those communities to thrive, and therefore that fulfills that right better? People's cultural associations with the land, the cultural significance, which again often is not considered in an environmental decision, like going away from climate change to talk about protected areas, for example, for conservation. There's a specific objective around nature conservation, but that might be land that also has great cultural significance, and that's important to people, and identity and mental well-being and so on. So this is what I think I mean by it. There's quite a clear analytical framework there, which has been applied in a lot of different contexts, this international kind of learning idea that we can maybe take. So that gives us you need to do a lot of work to figure out how to use it, but there's a structure there, I think.
Deb, sorry, Dieter, would you like to add anything?
Well, I think if you asked about climate change in particular, but in the natural capital frame generally, the scale of the challenge is pretty large, and someone's got to pay. And so the distributional question that arises is, first of all, how much output have you got to distribute? So there's always a tension between distribution and efficiency. And then secondly, who is actually going to pick up the tab if Scotland is going to do unilaterally what it has set out to deliver? And that's a question for any democratic system to address, and it goes well beyond who owns the land to a much wider question about what citizens are entitled to in a society. But what citizens get is a function of distributing the pie which is available to distribute. And when you look at the land, what strikes me is you can make that pie substantially bigger, and that's what I've been trying to stress, and trying to stress the opportunities that come from that. I mean, there are precise ways in which I think you should do that, but we might come on to that in the discussion.
So, I mean, maybe we can touch on that right now. I mean, you adroitly jumped straight ahead in your 5 minutes introduction to where we would want to get to, rather than some of the steps we need to get to.
Okay.
And one of the topics that's come up a lot this morning has been the role of culture change and the various different stakeholders who have a responsibility to make sure that we get onto this path and reach the targets that we are trying to get to. In your view, does the Land Rights and Responsibilities Framework provide a roadmap for that, or are there other types of cultural changes?
Okay, it's not a complete roadmap, nor could it be. There's plenty of other stuff that needs to go into this, but contextualise it. First of all, if you've got no idea of the prize you're trying to aspire to, it's pretty hard to work out the process to get there. Okay, so it is very important, and we do have for climate change an ambition for net zero carbon production. As I say, that may actually increase global warming, but if that's your target, it's a clear target that you want to go down, because you may substitute home production for imports. And that's the steel example I gave you. Now, what should you do? Well, a starting point is to say you can't work out what enhancements are available to the land in cities and outside unless you know what you've got. The old adage, if you don't know what you've got, you probably won't know until it's gone. Okay? So I think what you should do, which is what we've advocated for England, because my Natural Capital Committee only advised on England, is you should have a natural capital baseline for Scotland. And we suggest that the way to do that, it's like a doomsday book. You want to know what assets are available and potential to you. And the way to do that is to do an environmental census and repeat it every 5 years. And I would like, and it meets the engagement participation, I would like every school to be doing citizen science to feed into the construction of that database. I mean, John Hutton Institute has got the most phenomenal databases.
James Hutton.
James Hutton, that's really,
It's okay.
forgive me. I've had a long day. James Hutton, the Hutton Institute. Let me get away with that
That's
one,
the way
okay?
to do it.
The Hutton Institute has got a huge amount of data, but actually bringing this stuff together and using the technologies to put that together is a substantial step forward. So first of all, you work out the natural capital baseline. Technology advances enormously. I can tell you what's on every square 20 metres of Scotland, and I can tell you the layers of natural capital on every single metre of Scotland. We can do all this now remotely. It's a fantastic opportunity to see what's going on and what's available. So you do that first, then stage 2 is you say, given where we are, we now know what the baseline is, we want to improve, what are the hypothetical enhancements we could make? How could we sequestrate some more carbon? Could we plant some trees here? Could we do some stuff to the soils on the East Coast? What are these options? And then you rerun the baseline and you estimate what the Scottish land would look like if you made those changes. Then you look, are they economic? What's the return? And because resources are scarce, you concentrate on the best ones first and you work out. And that gives you a natural capital baseline, a census to engage the population, an identification of the economic opportunities that are out there to enhance the environment, and then you can then work out the investment frame, the bonds, the balance sheet for the natural capital, and you take it forward from there. And I think it's actually very straightforward what you need to do. But if you don't do those steps, you end up having a discussion without facts. If you don't have facts on the ground, it's pretty damn hard to say you're going in the right direction or the wrong direction.
Absolutely, thank you. And we've discussed this morning already the importance of financial capital, human capital, and now natural capital in terms of these wider discussions. I'm assuming that most of you know, but Professor Dieter Helm will be speaking on at the James Hutton Institute event this evening on natural capital further. I hope that many of you will be able to stay on here and join that. Debs, I wanted to move on a little bit to the other type of challenge that we were supposed to be discussing in this panel, the challenge of rising inequality. You spoke, and I know you've done a lot of research on this question of the remote and rural communities and what can make them more resilient, what can help to address this really quite catastrophic population projection figures. What role do you see the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement and the sort of framework that underpins that in helping to achieve those objectives?
Okay, thanks. Well, I guess what I wanted to answer a little bit to the question before as well, which was, this is an obvious thing I'm going to say, but I do think science has a really, really important role to play in terms of ensuring a just transition, because we don't actually know all the answers yet. We don't know all the trade-offs that are going to be required. So it is a really important point. And I was just thinking about science and scientists have a responsibility of demonstrating as well, more broadly, what the possibilities are. So, for instance, one thing that we've just been putting a lot of effort in at the Institute is to update our land capability for agriculture map so that it looks at land capability for agriculture in 2050 using the most recent climate projections. And that's really important information for farmers when they're planning what to do going forward. And it's demonstrating that which has a vital role to play. In terms of your question about rising inequality and what to do about it, I mean, the issue, it's so interesting in how very, very different our remote rural economies are, and I don't want to be in any way too generalistic here, but there are certain remote rural economies where over time what's happened is they've become far too, it's not their fault, but what's happened over time is they've become dependent on what we call transfer income, unearned local income, which is incredibly open to fluctuations in policy decisions. So for example, cap support payments or regional support payments or pension income isn't earned in the local economy. It flows into that local economy. It's variable. It's so what we need to do, what has to be done, is to re-engage local production and local labour source, and to try and just keep more people there. So it is about linking all the discussions that go on about housing with jobs. It's about having that full economy perspective, and basically that can only be done bottom up from an endogenous type type way, I think. So the issues that you were talking about in terms of community empowerment, again, we're in quite a good place in terms of the Community Empowerment Act, and we've seen some very, very positive things go forward. So we just need to reinforce that.
And do you see the government's recent commitments to sort of reinvigorate efforts around the land use strategy and the regional partnerships as a way of achieving that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that links actually as well also to the climate emergency issue.
Yeah.
I mean, the land use strategy is unique. I don't think we make enough, I'm not sure we have made enough of it. I mean, who else has a land use strategy as good as Scotland's land use strategy? And it's great to see it come through in the Programme for Government this time as being taken up again and taken forward. Because again, it requires that systems level looking at all aspects of sustainable development. So that's good.
And then one final question for you all before we open out into questions from the audience, which is that from the Scottish Land Commission's perspective, we're thinking about these challenges in urban areas as much as we are in rural areas. And I wonder if you have what you have to say about these particular issues in terms of what could be done for urban situations and peri-urban situations where the dynamics between these relationships and these challenges is very different.
Well, nearly everybody lives in an urban area. Most people don't live in the countryside. And the purpose of natural capital is not for the sake of nature. You know, to be blunt, nature doesn't care. You know, you don't find the swallows just migrating thinking, oh dear, there's only half as many this year as there was last year. I find it a tragedy. It affects me, but it's for us. So if you want natural capital delivered for people, and I'm especially concerned about air quality in cities, mental and physical health, particularly mental health for children, then you want natural capital right next to people. So an interesting experiment a colleague did was to compare developing a woodland on the edge of Cardiff and developing a woodland in the middle of Wales, and then asked, which do you think is better from a natural capital perspective? The environmentalists all thought it's good in the middle of Wales because nobody would go and disturb it. And actually, from a people's point of view, the important point is having it right next to the city. That's why green belts matter. That's why parks are incredibly important. If you walk through the middle of Edinburgh, as I did this morning, and I'm a regular visitor, but not as often as I'd like, and you go through all that green parkland below the station next to Princes Street, and you see all those people sitting out in the sunshine this morning and doing that. That doesn't get measured, but that's incredibly important as a right to people have access to that. So I think greening cities, and in my book I have a whole section on this, is at least as important as what we do in the countryside. And I think that's great that your Land Reform Commission is looking at the urban spaces, because a lot of them have been degraded, and a lot of kids, it's probably less so in Scotland, but in the big cities in the south, a lot of kids are not even within 500 metres of a green space. And I think that's a basic right, an entitlement for citizens to develop in a normal way. And it's no surprise we've got all these mental health problems. We know now scientifically from lots of studies that access to green is incredibly important. And you can measure it in stress levels, etc., to individuals. So urban, yes, really important. Would like to see it as important in what you do from a natural capital perspective as what you do in the rural areas. And there are lots of poor people in cities too.
Chris, Debs, would you add anything?
I think it's a little bit of a false dichotomy to think the issues are so very different between urban and rural areas. And I was mentioning to you earlier a piece of work that Annie and myself did a while ago. Actually, I just basically pinched what David Adams had written on brownfield development in urban areas, on the barriers to development in urban areas, and could transfer it very easily to rural areas, but obviously focus more on slightly different aspects in terms of communities. So I think there's an awful lot to learn between the two. It's excellent and quite right that the same emphasis is being given across both areas now.
I think the only thing I'd add is, yes, rural and urban, but also between different rural areas. I mean, the population issues, you're sparsely populated areas are very different than if you're close to the city. So there's actually multiple rurals as well. I think the framework it provides is equally applicable in urban context. I'm very well aware there's people in the audience who can probably speak better this to me from the urban point of view, but about the specifics of the justice and participation issues, but they occur there, and the rights framework I would think is quite a good analytical starting point in that context as well. So I'm going to throw over that way.
Great, thank you, Chris. No, I mean, I think it's really key for us to be able to directly connect the work that the Land Commission and the Vacant Derelict Land Task Force are trying to do to bring vacant derelict land in urban areas and peri-urban areas and rural areas too, but back into productive use with climate change objectives, well-being, physical and mental health objectives as important as the potential economic and productive, economically productive objectives of bringing that land back into use. So I would like to now open up for some questions from the audience. As with the previous question and answer sessions, can you please introduce yourself when you speak and tell us what your name is and where you're from, and as much as possible direct your question to a specific panelist. We are going to end, I would like to have a little bit of time for wrap-up feedback from the panellists, so we'll be finishing the question and answer sessions just about 4:10. First gentleman at the back with his hands up.
Mark Tennant, Scottish Land and Estates. Deborah, I'm delighted to hear you. You're the first person I've heard in any of these ramblings that, on green energy and other things and climate change, who has actually said, until we know what we have, we cannot possibly start. We need to know what we have. But one of the lines that I think you said after that was that you plant trees and you look at the return on those trees. In the new world, the return on those trees will not just be the cash crop. It will be the value of the carbon which you are sequestering. That implies a price for carbon. That implies carbon trading in a far better way than the European market does today. What plans do you think are in foot to make this happen?
Okay, very quickly. So it's exactly right. There has to be a price for carbon. And if Scotland wants to achieve its really demanding targets, you want the same price for emissions as sequestration, the same price in transport, the same price in agriculture, the same price in electricity generation. So essentially the market sorts out the cheapest ways of doing it. Now, that requires landowners to be paid for sequestrating carbon. It's the opposite of building a windmill. You know, you're essentially working as competitors to try to take carbon down. Now, how does that price develop? Well, first of all, there are loads of carbon prices in the economy already. Every time you go and fill up your tank, you're paying a carbon price. There are energy prices. There is a carbon floor price, and there is an EU ETS price. However, the way I think it's going to work on land, and I think that if you look at N-Trade in the Wessex Pool area, you have a model of a trading platform. You ask people to bid the carbon reductions they can make, and then people who want to buy those carbon emission reductions come into the market. And the great news is, because of the pressure of responsibility, etc., there's a whole host of companies who now want to be net zero, even though they don't have to be. Airlines are examples, energy companies, all pushing down this route because their investors demand it. So they have to buy those reductions. Now, Shell is doing it on a global scale, right? But when it comes to landowners, the package between what a landowner can offer, a market trading platform can deliver, and essentially what is a voluntary offset is a really good way to get started. You need the baseline to prove it's there. You need to have the trust to ensure that it's actually delivered. You need the capital maintenance, but it's something I'm working on extensively. It's already happening. The technology is in place. And if I was any landowner, the reason I'd like there to be a platform is because lots of small landowners can only do small bits of carbon sequestration. And if you're BA, that's not very interesting. What you want to do is buy a bundle of them to meet your overall objectives. So this is all incredibly practical. It is pretty revolutionary. The science does it, the baseline's required, and this is what farmers are going to be in the business of doing, as well as doing the other things they do as well. So it's a real possibility.
Sorry, can you use the microphone, please?
Yeah.
My other hat on, I'm actually chairing a major pension fund. I won't mention which one. But I'm now heading a movement from the pension fund world, and we have £500 billion worth of pension money. backing it, whereby we want every company that we own to have an audited carbon footprint.
Yeah.
The problem we've got is actually trying to get the regulation around it so it's all done the same way.
Yeah, so ESG done properly, which is properly monitored for every company, then forces those funds into this world. The only issue I would say to you is do not just concentrate on carbon, because you'll end up paying people to plant spruces and you'll lose all the other benefits. The great thing about the trading platforms is they're going to be natural capital trading platforms, so farmers can bid to reduce pollution into the water systems, water companies can bid in for those components, the National Health Service can bid in for the health benefits. You must make it multiple, otherwise the silo will do immense damage to the Scottish landscape, as the conifer forests have done in the past.
I was trying to keep it simple to begin with.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I think this is a really good example of why it's so important that the Scottish Government, in its programme for government, is focusing on a fair and green economy. It's not just about how many trees we plant, it's about how we make that just transition, which responds to the climate emergency, which is also fair and can help us achieve the much wider objectives that we have in Scotland around inclusive growth and, for example, diversity of land ownership. Who else has a question? There's a gentleman right at the very back.
Hi, Derek Irving from Central Scotland Green Network. It runs off the back of Dieter's last comment there, actually. We're at a really interesting point in Scotland where we have political acknowledgement of what seem to be the right agendas and the right priorities, but we have also got a series of changes to the planning system which are happening or imminent, both spatial planning and land use planning. I really worry about doing what seems to be the right thing, but doing it very badly wrong. And that was exactly the point Dieter was making there about spruces. How do we, at this point, collectively get the outcomes that we genuinely want, not the simple solutions that appear to be the right ones?
How do we get the outcomes we really need rather than rely on simply the simple solutions? Who would like to, Chris or
Well,
Deb?
just throw one thought in on that, which isn't an answer to the question, I suppose. But the point about culture change is very important, because I think we've seen over the years in similar contexts, lots of the right sort of policies coming through, or lots of the right thinking there, but the delivery, the implementation, what actually happens and the consequences of that, which is often a result, it seems, of the cultures that objective has to be met through, if you know what I mean, the way people implement it in practice. So I think the culture change is very important, but it's not an easy thing to say how it's done. But I would underline that.
I guess it would be just being pretty sure about what the outcomes we want are, and being very explicit about that. It relates a little bit to the point about not just focusing on one issue, not just carbon. We've got a biodiversity crisis as well at the moment, and these two on one level look as if they could be solved by the same problems, but not always the case, actually, as the Sitka spruce situation highlights. So I think it's about being very clear what the outcomes are, and then just getting away, as we already are, from the sort of sectoral positions only, sectoral policies only, thinking cross-sector and thinking about sustainable development in all of its dimensions.
I mean, most of these great initiatives, and this is a great initiative, flounder on the back of lobbyists capturing the economic rents. And, you know, since there is a lot of public money involved in all these things and a lot of public distribution, beware the lobbyists coming to collect the maximum amount from the trough. And if you look at the history of the big subsidised industries over the last 50 years, that's exactly what's happened. And so keeping these processes open, it's not my territory, but I think this issue of participation and citizens having rights regardless of their ability to pay lobbyists to do things, etc., is crucial, not just to getting the process going, but carrying it through. And the reason that I'm an economist, you might think I would think this anyway, the reason I think I like things like carbon prices is it's blimmin' hard to argue for a particular carbon price for yourself. The carbon price finds out what the cheapest routes are, as opposed to those who can shout loudest and lobby hardest and get as many politicians on their side. So I like the clarity of a carbon price out there so that people face the same terms regardless of their particular interests.
Can I just
Yeah,
say
of course,
one
yeah.
thing else? It just struck me in the early... I wasn't here this morning, I'm afraid, so I didn't hear all of the land tax valuation discussions. But just now, when people were talking about land values, it just struck me that people didn't talk explicitly about the how policy affects land values, and how in the past agricultural policy has certainly been capitalised into the value of land.
Yeah,
And so one really important thing about thinking about the future is making sure that the policy mechanisms that are used, we know fully what impact they will have on land values, because that will affect how land is used. And different policy instruments have very different effects on land. We know that. We've seen it through the history of the CAP.
Yeah. Well,
So one thing in theory that should happen if policy support changes is land price. You don't need a land tax for land prices to come down. They could come down through a change in the policy mechanism.
if you take out the basic farm payment, which basically pays people to own land, that's capitalised in the land price. So you can work out almost precisely what, other things being equal, the fall in land value is going to be. And if you look at land prices, I don't know much about Scottish land prices, but I know a lot about English land prices. They bear almost no resemblance to the economic return on the land. That is crazy. And that stops entrance, that stops new people coming into the business. It takes the land price as becoming economically independent from the economic reality of what's returned. And that's crucial. And that's both the tax subsidies that are capitalised in the land price, in the south, particularly inheritance tax, but also business rates, and also, as a side, red diesel. But it also applies to the basic farm payment, which is just a straightforward capital value transfer from European taxpayers to landowners. And it's really distorting what happens on the land.
Thank you, Tito. Who else has got questions? Chris, I see your hand. I have to say, though, there has been a slight imbalance in gender from the questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask Chris and the lady beside you in the orange jumper, Chris, and then one more lady, and then I'm afraid that will be the end of the questions, and we can carry on this discussion after we've finished at 4:30.
My name's Fiona Savage. Is this on? Yes, it is. And one of the things I've heard bandied about today in quite a lot of the presentations is that we need a culture change. And going back to Professor Helm's comment about if we don't understand where we are just now within our culture, what is our predominant culture, what are the next phases of culture that naturally come through, how do we know where we're going? It's the map question that you said earlier on about looking at the land. I don't think it's so much a culture change we need. I think it's a paradigm shift, which is quite different from a culture change. And we ban these words around and not understanding what our current culture is. And I did some work on that in ULAB and the Firestarter Festival in the public sector, which was quite interesting. So I'd wonder how you think you're going to create this culture change when you're not sure what the baseline is at the moment.
I mean, if I could just add to what I was saying, it's quite a general phrase. In my mind, what I'm referring to specifically is institutional cultures. It's not the culture of everybody in the country. So policies are implemented. In this case, I'm thinking particularly of the sort of public institutions that go out and implement through policy measures. And so I'm thinking quite specifically of that context. There are other kinds of cultures that perhaps need to change as well. And in that context, we have seen things shifting. I mean, so for instance, a part of the culture is not necessarily to invite participation and empowerment of people. It's, you go out and you implement policy, two people or to two places. And that has been shifting. I think the last number of years we see it shifting because there's a push from outside the institutions, if you like, from whether it's new legislation coming through, new sort of policies driving it. It also changes because examples come through where people can see things being done differently. There's a number of different ways in which it changes. So I was thinking about that specific context, if that helps.
Debs, do you like to add anything?
Just examples of best practice and sharing where there's been really fundamental change within communities with other communities is a really good way of people seeing opportunities. I think just in terms of, this is a very silly example in some sense, but I'm a farmer's daughter and I was at home and I hadn't finished something in time, so I come from Cornwall. You don't need to know all of this. I'm just digging myself in a hole.
Really interesting.
But anyway, I was finishing a report on agroforestry, and I was showing. I said, "Oh God, I'm going to need some pictures to put in it." So I was finding some photographs to put in it, and my mum just went, "Oh, Deb, what is that?" You know, she just could not see how agroforestry could ever be a way that farmers would want to farm. She just fundamentally couldn't. She's just, and I said, "Well, Mum, you know, it's happening in other places," and I sort of showed her and I talked to her more about other examples. And then we talked a lot about how actually it's got production benefits. And in fact, the farm at one of the Hutton farms at Glen Soch, we put in our agroforestry experiment in the 1980s before the climate emergency was even begun to be thought of. It was all about its production benefits. And so it's basically talking to people, demonstrating, showing best practice and showing the potentials, and education.
But what comes from what you described so eloquently about rural communities is what's missing is young entrepreneurial people running exciting businesses, thinking they're going to make a business, a life for themselves. And that comes from having released the economic potential. The land has to be viable, the price has to be there, you need broadband so that you don't need to do all the travelling that goes with it, and you really have to think about these new natural capital products. To be blunt, the average age of farmers in Britain, I don't know about Scotland, is at least 60, and I'm over 60. I find it quite hard to change my culture. I'm pretty well set in my ways. What you want is people in their 20s not wanting to leave North Uist. They want to stay, they want to build their business, and you only do that by making sure it's actually profitable. And that's about prices for the things that they deliver. It's about broadband to enable it and to give it a small business context, given that we don't want another experiment like Lever Hume Harris and all the devastation that was left behind. But that bit, you have to have an opportunity for young people to make businesses sing. Otherwise, you're trying to change older people like myself, and to get leopards to change their spots is pretty hard, even if I'm sure you managed to do it on your farm in Cornwall.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we've run out of time for questions, but there will be hopefully some time after from 4:30 onwards to carry on this conversation amongst ourselves and with the panellists. I'm afraid I've got a bit of a tricky question to ask you all to finish on. Next year, 2020, will provide two opportunities for Scotland to showcase what it's doing when it comes to land reform and around climate change. As we heard from the Cabinet Secretary this morning, there'll be an international conference on land reform the Scottish Government is organising. Glasgow has also been chosen as the city for the next conference on parties, the COP26 for the climate change negotiations. I'd like to ask you two things. First, what can Scotland showcase at these events? And second, what should Scotland try and learn?
You should try in the other order.
Okay, learn first. Okay,
Okay,
I'm sorry, Chris.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, showcase. Well, let's just pick up on what we were just discussing. I think we do have some really great examples of how things can be done differently. I'm going to look over at you, Sally, sorry, but the peatland restoration, for example, the example of SNH working with a community landowning trust and then across the Western Isles for bringing forward peatland restoration initiatives. So that collaborative, participatory, kind of different way of doing it from a big public institution and communities, for example. Or we heard about the West Harris Trust, and there's many examples in there as well earlier. So showcase, I think, those examples which are, this is not just theoretical, it's being done, and these are models, I think, in there, with all the problems, I'm sure. What can we learn? A huge amount. I think globally there has been a huge amount done around delivering justice in relation to these environmental issues, and as you very well know, I'm sure. So inviting people to come and share that, I mean, there's probably too much to mention in one sentence, but there's a lot there. Yeah.
Great. Debs?
I think you've got huge things to choose from in terms of what you can showcase. I think, as I said before, I think the land use strategy in Scotland is really, really unique. I think that should be something that we make much more of. I think the peatlands example of what we're currently doing in terms of peatlands restoration is world leading, and that would be to showcase. In terms of trying to learn, I think, for me, I think it is about the governance issue, and it's how at the moment our local authorities are very big. I think one councillor represents about 4,000 people in a local authority in Scotland. That's an awful lot of people if you're trying to initiate and empower people. So learning more about governance structures in other countries and how it can be done effectively at the local level would be something I think is important.
2 examples. The peat, because it's globally significant, and the work that's being done will make a global difference to climate change, regardless of what other policies you pursue. And I would go and showcase the indoor vertical farm at James Hutton, which changed my mind about land use, because it will open up the delegates' minds to the possibility that we can use the land for other things as well as agriculture, and that it's not a constraint on using every inch to dig for victory, but to really think what we can do with the land. And just to make sure that you make an impact on climate change, I would get the Irish to all visit your peat bogs and then stand there and explain why they're running 3 peat-powered power stations, the third one of which reopened recently. I was in Dublin last Monday at a huge gathering on climate change. It was brilliant, led by the electricity company, and the front page of the Irish Times had ESP reopens its peat power station. So if you can get them to close that, you can go away from Glasgow and say, tick, we achieved something for the climate.
Thank you very much, Dieter. Well, I hope this has given us all food for thought in terms of the relationship between our land rights and our responsibilities and these broader, very significant challenges that we are facing in the coming years. Thank you all very much. I'd like to all ask you to join me in thanking our panellists for this very interesting discussion. Thank you.